Welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. I'm your host, Dmitri Alperovitch, and this is a podcast where we go deep behind the headlines to analyze the pressing geopolitical issues of the day. Today, we dive into all things nukes with Vipin Narang, professor of nuclear security and political science and director of the Center for Nuclear Security Policy at MIT. Vipin was also the acting assistant secretary of defense for space policy, a portfolio which included all U.S. nuclear weapons employment strategies. Vipin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dmitri. Good to see you again. It feels like Munich was a lifetime ago.
That's right. We were at Munich Security Conference together where we had a fascinating dinner on this topic. But you just recently co-wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs with Pranay Vadi, another former White House official focused on these issues, called How to Survive the New Nuclear Age. Fascinating piece that I want to dive into. But first, I'd be remiss not to ask you your thoughts on the just concluded 12-day war that Israel had with Iran, where we obviously participated. Your thoughts on the strategic implications of that conflict, damage assessments in terms of the impact on the Iranian nuclear program, and whether you think this whole thing was a good idea or not.
Yeah, no, hey, it's a great place to start, Dmitri. Thanks for having me. Good to be here. Iran was this slow boil since the Trump administration withdrew from the JCPOA in 2017. And before the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, Iran was subject to intense historic verification of its nuclear program. And, sort of the metric for how far Iran was away from a nuclear weapon was sort of measured by this not perfect concept, but sort of at least a uniform indicator or consistent indicator, breakout time. How far was Iran away from having enough enriched fissile material for a nuclear weapon? That doesn't mean they have a nuclear weapon. It means they have, call it 25 kilograms of highly enriched weapons-grade uranium. When the Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA, I think the estimate was about a year, because they were stockpile of low-enriched uranium was small. They were not running the centrifuges and many of the centrifuges at a rate that would enrich that small amount to a point where they have enough for a weapon in sort of a shorter time frame than a year. When Pranay and I left office, Pranay left after I did. I left in August of last year. Iran was, and I think it was somebody testified in Congress recently that they were, basically days away from having the ability to enrich from their 60% stockpile, which had grown over time, to enough weapons-grade uranium for a single weapon. Now, that doesn't mean they have a weapon, right? And so the disputes about the intelligence estimates that we keep seeing, whether Tulsi Gabbard is right or whether the Israelis are right, whether they were close or not, it's not really the right sort of way to think about it. They were closer, and they were, several days to weeks maybe from having the ability to enrich uranium to have enough fissile material for a bomb. But that's not a bomb, right? It's not multiple bombs. It's not an arsenal. It's not deliverable. And so I think sort of both assessments are right in their own way. Iran wasn't imminently approaching a nuclear weapons arsenal or capability, but it was certainly a lot closer than it was 7-8 years ago. And so I think the Israelis decided, for a variety of reasons, and I think probably based on the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, the president didn't want Netanyahu to start this conflict while negotiations were ongoing, because it obviously terminated Iranian incentive to negotiate. But then once Israel started, the president was faced with this dilemma about whether the U.S. would support the operation and prosecute the key targets at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan that the Israelis could not, because they did not have the massive ordnance penetrator, or the GBU-57. Only we have it, and we're the only ones that can deliver it with a B-2. It has to be, in order to accurately deliver it, has to be delivered by a B-2 stealth bomber. And the operation, the president decided, I think, given where the conflict was at that point, it's sort of reasonable to say, would you rather Fordo be damaged or not? Probably, yeah. You're probably in a world where you've already sort of put ourselves in the crosshairs of Iran because we've supported Israel defensively. And the question is, where you were at that point in that state of the world, is it better to degrade Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan, or let them, sort of sit and have the Israelis do what they could do, but not as effectively as we could? And so I think the president made the very difficult decision, because it's a 50-50 decision at that point. And I think the damage and the assessments that came out afterwards show why. We probably degraded Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan, but we did not completely eliminate, first of all, the enriched uranium they had, their ability to produce centrifuges and reconstitute a program. And I don't know that we know the state of the centrifuge hull at Fordo, which is so deeply buried, and we may not know for a while. And so, again, this discussion about whether the sites were obliterated or not is not the right question. It's how further back do we set back the Iranian program? And it appears it was, it set it back, but whether it's a couple of weeks, a couple months, or a couple years is a really important question.
So the way I think about it is that there are basically roughly 5 parts to their program that are of concern to us, right? One is the weaponization research, and while ostensibly they stopped the work on assembling the weapon in 2003 based on our intelligence assessment, certainly a lot of theoretical work continued and the scientists with knowledge still were present.
Yeah, this is 1940s technology, right? So, like, a gun type device or an implosion device. I mean, we think they have designs from the Pakistanis, and like some of the knowledge transfer, the tacit knowledge, to your point, is not going to go away. You can kill a lot of scientists, but I think you and I, with enough time and the fissile material, probably get something to work.
Yeah,
So,
but the work to do the whole shockwave generation, neutron initiation, like that requires facilities, and looks like Israel hit those pretty hard. So hard to determine,
it's
you
just
know,
hard to know.
yeah, how much damage was done, but fair to say probably significant. The second part is the enrichment facilities, the Fordo, Natanz. Certainly we hit those, Israelis hit those, probably did significant damage, but we don't know what we don't know. And, they announced this covert facility right before the war that in public domain, at least, we don't even know where it exists. So certainly not completely decimated in terms of enrichment facilities, most likely. The third one is the centrifuge manufacturing, and Israelis hit some of those, but then there's the deep one in Natanz that even the MOPS can't reach, so they can still produce centrifuges. And then the fourth one, which is where the administration and others are putting a lot of their eggs in the basket, is sort of these auxiliary facilities. They're conversion facilities, right? Conversion of uranium yellow cake into hexafluoride
Yeah.
gas
Yep. And then
for
the metal.
enrichment. And then on the other end of it, once you have the enriched uranium, converting it into a metal that can be shaped into a sphere for a bomb. Israelis obliterated those. So even if you have the enriched uranium, weapons grade, you can't necessarily convert it to a bomb. Although there's some folks like Jeffrey Lewis, James Acton, they're saying, wait a second, this is not that hard. You can do it in a chemistry lab. So even though those facilities were destroyed, maybe it's not as big of a deal as that might look. And then the last piece is the enriched uranium, the stockpile, 408 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium that can be enriched to 90% within a few weeks. If you have the centrifuges in the facilities, that is sort of out in the wind, and no one really knows what happened to that. Is that a fair way
I think that's
to think
exactly
about
right,
this?
right? You've got, and you can sort of, there are bottlenecks in each of those. And if you degrade a little bit of each, which is essentially what we did, or we tried to do, with the caveat that I don't know what the status of the stockpile is, but every other piece of it, we probably degraded a little bit. And so to reconstitute each piece of the other 4 pieces, I think that's a good way to think about it, will take some time. The open-ended question is, how much damage do we do in each of those pieces? And are there sort of workarounds the Iranians have that can accelerate the reconstitution of some of those pillars, basically, towards a bomb? And I think the big strategic question, and I don't want to sleep on this, is for the Iranians walking away from this, Iran has been on the precipice, further away, closer over the last, since 2003, basically. And the big lesson after the 12-day war here is, next time when they get a shot, I don't think they sit on the precipice. I think they go, because
Well,
right now,
do you think, I think this is a question, right? They made a strategic decision clearly to be a threshold nuclear state, right?
correct,
For decades, and
correct.
not move towards assembly of the weapon. It seems like, for both Iran and frankly other states that may be thinking about this, that was a really dumb decision, right? You either go for it or you don't, but being on the threshold is probably the worst
Yep,
possible situation
yep.
to be
You
in,
can't be Libya, you can't be Syria. You
right?
got to be Kim Jong-un,
So you
right?
either race for it or you don't. And I guess no one knows what lesson they're going to extract from this, whether it's better to start racing, although now they're set back and they maybe hit again, and maybe even leadership
You have to keep
decapitation
mowing the
could be
lawn,
on the
right? I
tech.
mean, that's sort of the
Yeah.
right. And that's why this question of, like, how far did you delay it is important, because that's when, Israel or the US would have to continue to mow the lawn. I mean, the presidents and Netanyahu's threats personally against the Ayatollah also may condition, to your point, this change in willingness to stay on the threshold. I mean, I think Iran stayed on the threshold because there was a world in which, if integration into the global economy, and unlike North Korea, which was essentially a hermit kingdom and now has a safety valve with Russia and China because of largely the Ukraine war, Iran can't bank on that. I think Iran, like, there's a world in which there were moderates in Iran who really wanted to be, a normal state. And so there was an opportunity to convince them to forestall weaponization in order to become, essentially a responsible member of the international community. But I think that, to your point, is now, that the 12-day war is going to sort of discredit that argument going forward in Iran. I think the lesson is you can't sit on the threshold anymore. The only regime insurance, and if you're the Ayatollah, the only personal insurance you have against an assassination attempt is essentially, a nuclear capability.
Well, I don't know that I agree, because that's one possibility. The other possibility is if we race to the weapon, we're going to get killed.
Well, so you have to do it covertly. I think the other big lesson is you're gonna disperse it. You're gonna do it covertly. You're gonna try and reduce the indicators. The problem, though, I think, to your point, this is one open-ended sort of question we don't know the answer to. The Iranian program also seems to be so penetrated.
That's exactly right. If you're sitting in Iran with all these assassinations that took place of senior official scientists, you're paranoid that there's a Mossad agent under every bed, right?
I mean, this notion that this just drives it underground, I mean, it was pretty underground anyway. So, the ability to really drive the program underground completely may be impossible, or at least I have to fear it is, because I think they've been shown to be so penetrating.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go back to your article, which is on broader strategic issues. And there's one sentence in that piece that really struck me. You say, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, Washington will need to develop more, different, and better nuclear capabilities and begin to deploy them in new ways. Explain why.
That's a great question. I think that is sort of the bluff. If there's like a tweet that describes the article, is probably that. And I think part of it is, we set the stage with what we call essentially this category 5 hurricane of nuclear threats that we didn't anticipate at the end of the Cold War. We thought the strategic competition with Russia was going to forever disappear. And the New START Treaty in 2010, 2011 anticipated further cuts and reductions in the US and Russian arsenal in a way that when we sized our modernization program at the same time, we actually didn't size it one for one for legacy programs, right? So the article goes into some depth on the math. The ICBM program, which is the land leg of the triad, is one for one. The bomber leg persists, and you're getting the B-21. But the sea leg, which is sort of the most important for survivability of U.S. forces, and also really
because submarines are so hard,
because it's hard to find, and so critical to our nuclear strategy, has, the bottom line is a 43% reduction in launcher capacity. So our submarine capacity for that leg of the triad, if the modernization program delivers as designed and intended, without any delays, without any adjustments, witnesses a 43% reduction in the sea leg alone.
And that's because we're going from the higher class ballistic missile submarines to the Columbia class, which carry fewer Trident.
Third less, and we're buying fewer. It's when you do the fewer number of boats and the 1/3 reduction in tube availability, maximum tube availability. And there's some nuances there that are all in the article. It's a net 43% reduction, 336 tubes to 192. And that's at a time, right? So we anticipated further cuts with Russia. That assumption turned out to be false. We assumed that China would continue to be, and this is the most important piece, I think, China would continue to be what we called a quote unquote lesser included case, where we did not need to size any piece of our force posture because of China's nuclear forces. But Xi Jinping has chosen to undertake and embark on this historic expansion. And we go into some detail that it's not just about the numbers of the expansion, but the composition of China's forces and the choices that Xi Jinping and China are making to develop hundreds of prompt ICBM silos in the hinterland of China. That in order to implement our enduring strategy, and we go into some detail why we should continue to implement our enduring strategy and not target population centers, but to eliminate to the extent practicable the adversaries, and in this case, Russia and China's ability to use their nuclear weapons against the allies or the U.S. homeland, to limit damage to the U.S. homeland population, infrastructure, and our allies' population, territory, and infrastructure, will require us to hold at risk these hundreds of silos, which we never had to account for. In a lot of ways,
And just to give the numbers here, so China for decades had about 300 nuclear weapons, double that roughly, right, to 600 now. They want to get to at least 1,000 by the end of the decade, 1,500 by 2035. But the most interesting thing that I thought that you had in this piece is talking not just about the ICBMs and the submarine-based deterrence force that they've built, but also lower yield, shorter range weapons that they might use against our allies regionally or our own forces regionally in a fight over Taiwan. So you think that this is not just a deterrent force, this might be an offensive force. China, of course, for decades has had a no first use policy, but do you think that might be changing now?
I think I mean, I don't know anyone in the U.S. government who believes China's no first use policy. There's a joke that maybe even China doesn't believe its own no first use policy. But I think, it's the big strategic takeaway I think that Pranay and I wanted to make was that, we spent a lot of time now talking about the technicalities of enrichment and the triad and ICBMs and launchers. The real important takeaway I think that we wanted folks to have when they read the piece was that nuclear weapons are back in geopolitics, and that Russia and China are using their nuclear forces and the nuclear weapons they're trying to develop to support their geopolitical objectives. So Russia's revisionism is supported by this massive treaty unaccounted and unrestricted tactical nuclear weapon force, up to 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons that are not covered by New START. And they're designed to allow Russia to aggress against Ukraine or the Baltics or neighboring states and deter US and NATO intervention to unwind that aggression. And I think China, Pakistan recently also, North Korea have taken a page out of that playbook where they realized that there is this opportunity for limited offense or revisionism to support their geopolitical objectives, backed by a nuclear shield. And we're seeing China fill out the same kind of strategy, maybe not in the same sort of numbers yet that Russia has, but I look at China's force posture, and it may be that they don't know what they want to do with it yet, but it is certainly capable of supporting a strategy that the Russians have undertaken in Europe. And the challenge for the US is, how do you deter this in two theaters, one a land theater in Europe, and then a maritime theater in the Indo-Pacific, which is something we haven't had to do until now. The North Koreans didn't really have nuclear capabilities until the mid-2010s, and China never threatened to use nuclear weapons first in a regional contingency over, say, Taiwan or the South China Seas until very recently also. So for 75 years, essentially, we didn't have to think about what a maritime conflict with China or North Korea would look like under a nuclear overhang. And that's why this is different than the Cold War and demands, I think, really senior level attention to what it takes to deter Chinese and Russian aggression, North Korean aggression, but also assure our allies in these regions that we can meet the challenge, that sort of presents itself.
So let's have a little bit of debate on this, because the crux of your argument really is that the numbers of weapons are going up with China, with North Korea, with Pakistan, etc., and we need to match that in order to be able to do counterforce.
I do want to clarify: we don't say we don't need to match it, and and it's important that when we talk about deterrence is not a numbers game. It's sort of, do you have the right types of capabilities, both nuclear and non-nuclear? We don't want anyone to walk away thinking that the solution to all of this is only nuclear. Problem is, conventional is very expensive also, right? And so you need both the right mix of conventional capabilities, but also the right mix of nuclear capabilities if the adversary chooses to potentially escalate to the nuclear level in the theater, to be able to manage escalation. And then the numbers are not Russia plus China plus one, right? It's, do we have a sufficient number of strategic forces to be able to, in the minds of both adversaries at the same time, convince them that there's no pathway through which the use of nuclear weapons will help them achieve their geopolitical goals. And the way we implement our strategy, we don't use nuclear weapons to hold at risk China's sea-based capabilities. So if they put all their weapons at sea, actually, we wouldn't have to make any real adjustments to our strategic forces. But it's the growth in the Chinese land-based forces, the ICBMs in particular, that stress the size of the force. But again, it's not the total number of the Chinese nuclear arsenal. It's, what do we need to hold at risk these targets, and the same in Russia.
Yeah. So basically, what do we need for counterforce deployment to neutralize the launch capabilities of those countries, right? And I guess my question is twofold. One, and you kind of alluded to this, why does it have to be nuclear if the goal is preempt launch? anything that goes boom in a silo or, can target a submarine will work. And it's much easier to develop conventional strike capabilities because they're dual use. You can use it in lots of conflicts. Nuclear, you'll sort of use as a last resort. A TLAM against a silo, I presume, will work just as well, a Tomahawk, non-nuclear Tomahawk, as an ICBM, right? So why do we need to increase significantly, which is your argument, our ICBM force, whether sea-based or land-based, to target those silos?
So a good question. One, it's not all nuclear. So for the submarine-based forces, it's actually conventional anti-submarine warfare. So that's number one. Number two, would love non-nuclear options to be able to hold at risk ICBM silos or mobile ICBMs. And here there are opportunities maybe in cyber, for example, left of launch. But when the time comes, you're not sure whether those will be available. And so then you're looking at sort of kinetic options. And here, conventional is actually not capable of prosecuting hardened silos deep in the Russian or Chinese hinterlands. One, because a TLAM doesn't have the reach. Number two, you need the overpressure generated by a nuclear airburst to be able to destroy a hardened silo. So a conventional capability actually, and we saw this with Fordo, for example, with deep hardened sort of facilities, and a silo with a hardened cap is tantamount essentially to that. The amount of conventional capability you would need to be able to disable the silo far exceeds what we have the ability to actually put on target. So you need the range of an ICBM because a TLAM can't get there. And you don't necessarily want a mix of conventional and nuclear tipped ICBMs for a variety of strategic stability reasons. But I would argue even a conventional warhead, what used to be known as prompt global strike, conventional warheads on an ICBM can't hold at risk hardened silos, right? So you might be able to get the mobiles with conventional. I actually think there's, and Stratcom and there's this myth that the targeters just want to put nukes on everything. Actually, it's the exact opposite. Planners want to use as few nuclear weapons as possible to hold at risk the targets they need to hold at risk with nuclear weapons because they're always worried about future rounds. So they want to withhold as many nuclear weapons as possible, inflict as little damage as necessary to achieve presidential objectives because that leaves open bargaining space to end the conflict, but it also preserves capability in case the adversary continues to escalate. And then there's the very real, sort of damage point, which is for some of these targets, particularly hardened ICBM silos, you have to use a nuclear weapon to disable the silo.
Okay. So you made a compelling case that counterforce has to be nuclear in many of these cases. But let's talk about countervalue, right? So in the 1950s, under the Eisenhower administration, we did have a massive retaliation strategy that targeted not just the military facilities and these launchers, but also cities, industrial centers, leadership targets. And in the 60s, we moved away from that. But why not start thinking about returning to that strategy, particularly thinking about leadership focus, right? If you signal to Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and others that any use of a nuclear weapon, and by the way, all these countries, including us, have declared that a nuclear war should never be fought, right? So we're not talking about low-level nuclear war. Our position is no nuclear war should be fought, period. So any use of nuclear weapon will mean retaliation against leadership targets, i.e. Moscow, Beijing, etc., with massive nuclear salvos. So why not go to that strategy?
So, leadership targets, counterforce is not just, sort of targeting the adversary's nuclear weapons. It does include command and control targets as well. For apex leadership, the presumption is that they will be in bunkers that are survivable in any nuclear conflict. So it would be very difficult to decapitate our adversaries, though not impossible. I would also, I want to caveat all of this with the U.S. approach to nuclear strategy has never been one of warfighting. Counterforce is often sort of conflated with warfighting. It is believed to be the best deterrent. Damage limitation as a concept, which includes counterforce, but also includes missile defenses. The idea that the United States can limit damage to both the ally and to the U.S. homeland is believed to be the best deterrent to an adversary thinking it can achieve its objectives through the employment of nuclear weapons. And here, the allied portion of it is very important because the U.S. takes on a unique obligation that no other nuclear power does, which is it extends the nuclear umbrella non-contiguously across two vast oceans to allies who are nervous that, we wouldn't use nuclear weapons to defend them. And so how do you convince the ally? In fact, nuclear weapons are probably, 10% deterrence and 90% assurance to allies, which is sort of the off quoted line. And there, the damage limitation concept is critical to underpinning the credibility of extended deterrence, because we have to convince the ally not that we'd be willing to trade San Francisco for Seoul, but that if we fight to save Seoul, we are unlikely to lose San Francisco. That convinces a South Korean leadership that the U.S. can and may be willing to actually fight for it, because it can essentially, quote unquote, immunize the homeland through a variety of counterforce targeting and missile defenses to soak up residuals.
So I understand how that argument sort of works in theory, but practically speaking, when you're talking, let's say just Russia, 1,500 or so deployed nuclear weapons, right? Not to mention tactical ones that they could be used regionally against our forces. Does anyone really believe, most importantly, Russia itself, but certainly our decision makers, that in any sort of nuclear conflict, we'll be able to neutralize all of those launch capacities, either with, preemptive strikes against them or with missile defense, and that none will get through?
Well, so this gets to your question about counterpopulation targeting strategy, right? So if you engage in counterpopulation targeting strategy, Russia then, and you have not targeted their nuclear forces, Russia then has 1,550 available nuclear weapons to unload on the United States homeland and wipe out essentially the entire American population. With counterforce targeting, right, there's not that it's a variable. Some days are going to be better than others, but the planners at Stratcom and the Pentagon, I think over time, especially with Russia, less so with China, is it, sort of the intelligence and the symphony that would, sort of kick off an attempt to target Russian nuclear forces can at least degrade that force substantially so that you can't get them all. But if you can get 1,500 of the 1,550, that's meaningful damage limitation. So
yeah, but that still means that Washington probably gets destroyed.
Again, depends on sort of what your missile defense architecture looks like. And if you can shrink the adversary's force to a point where the residuals are manageable, then this is where the theory of at least the limited version of Golden Dome and our sort of evolution of ground-based missile defense, which isn't perfect, but is getting much, much better between our regional missile defenses and increasingly our homeland missile defenses. This is why, it's not just counterforce. It's sort of the entire damage limitation concept. But
let me just ask you, theoretically, let's play this out, right? The scenario. We are targeting, we're in a conflict with Russia, let's say. We decided to target their nuclear forces, submarine-based and ICBMs, and we managed to destroy most of it, let's say 90%, very ambitious. And they launched a retaliatory strike against Washington, Boston, New York, etc., and some of it gets through and millions of people are dead. Are you telling me that the president of the United States will not do a countervalue strike at that point and destroy Moscow?
I mean, those options are always available to the president, right? So remember, U.S. nuclear strategy does not require damage limitation. It is to create the option for damage limitation so that a president is not faced with the choice of potentially losing 200 million Americans. And it sounds macabre and it sounds, insane to say that, there's a difference between losing 20 million Americans versus 200 million Americans, old Herman Kahn line. But that is a meaningful difference, right?
Do you think politically for a president that's going to be a meaningful difference? I mean, both of these are just unimaginable.
We hope that the posture itself and the strategy is such a powerful deterrent that you're never put in that position in the first place. But I do think for any U.S. president, the ability to flip the framing, the ability to save 180 million American lives, potentially, by implementing a strategy we've had now for 80 years, I think would be both morally and legally appealing to an American president. Remember, there are legal reasons why we don't engage in counterpopulation targeting strategy also, right? Scott Sagan, Yanina Dill have done some good work on this. And there's a new compendium by Lawrence Livermore's Center for Global Security Research, CGSR. It's publicly available. There's some great essays, not just by American strategists, but also international strategists, French, UK, that sort of walk through the moral and legal reasons for damage limitation and counterforce targeting. The moral and legal reasons are compelling, but they're also compelling strategic reasons as to why this is a more powerful deterrent. And it sort of sows doubt in the adversary's mind that they could achieve their objectives.
This is where I have a problem with it, because if you flip the script, and you're right, 780 million Americans is a compelling argument, obviously, for any president. But let's think about it from a Vladimir Putin's perspective. Do you think the reason he's not going to launch a nuclear strike against the United States is because he can only kill 20 million Americans versus 200 million Americans? or because he knows that Moscow is going to be destroyed and other major cities in Russia if he
Well,
launches?
so I'm not sure that Putin and Xi care about their populations in the way an American president cares about the American population, right? Just the nature of the regimes. I think Vladimir Putin is more likely to be deterred if he knows he's going to lose all of his nuclear forces and military capacity, right? And that is sort of the primary objective of U.S. nuclear strategy, to degrade their nuclear capabilities and their military capabilities. And what it takes to deter Russia and China is different from what it takes to deter the United States. In fact, our adversaries engaging in counter-population targeting strategies against us is actually not nonsensical because we value our population, right? And so
Yeah, I look, do they care about the people, individual people? No. But do they care about the historical destruction of their capitals, for example, and other major cities? Yes, they do. I guarantee you Putin cares about Moscow and St. Petersburg
I'm
and
sure.
doesn't want them to be
I
decimated.
mean, in any case, in any counterforce targeting strategy, there's going to be a lot of destruction of Moscow in the first place. But, I think historically, the assessment has been that both Soviet and now, Putin, Soviet leaders and Putin value their military and nuclear forces above all else. And so the ability to hold those at risk has proven to be a powerful deterrent until it fails. I mean, I feel like, we're in the realm of religion here because you and I have fought as many nuclear wars as each other and everybody else, thankfully. And, I think part of the debate now is, I think if you
But if you think about why would he care about the destruction of his nuclear forces, it's because he views that as a deterrent from the country and himself getting destroyed, right? So at the end of the day, what they care about is their own lives and I think also their countries surviving.
There's I don't think they're mutually exclusive, number one, but number two, I think that they value the nuclear forces and military forces to preserve either the Soviet Empire or sort of the existence of the Russian state, by which I think Putin defines that as the regime and not the population of Russia. And so, there's the deterring Russia is actually sort of the easier of the two cases because I think we've just had so much experience over time over how to do it and communicate with each other. In the Ukraine war, right? There's been tacit communication between Russia and the US. We know what each other's baselines are in terms of nuclear force posture, generation of forces, and what deviations from those baseline look like. I mean, with China, it's going to be more challenging because they're still developing their baseline. They may not even know what their baseline is. And so we may not perceive signals about Chinese resolve or readiness to escalate in the same way that we know what it looks like with Russia. And that's sort of concerning as we enter this new era as well. But I think, when we think about nuclear force posture, the discussion about and nuclear strategy, the discussion to move away from damage limitation concepts to countervalue or counterpopulation targeting, I think you have to confront two things if you support that. So the Charlie Glazer, James Acton articles, Steve Feder articles on this. One, you are exposing the U.S. homeland to just exceptional retaliation. And is that sort of morally acceptable for a U.S. president? But the other is the extended deterrence problem, right? So if you expose the U.S. homeland to that kind of destruction, your allies are no longer going to believe that you're going to fight to save them, right? Because they're worried of, sort of decoupling between themselves and the U.S. as the U.S. homeland becomes increasingly at risk. This is what drove France to...
But hold on, Vipin, because we just had this conversation, right? That you're not going to prevent all launches, and it's a question of 20 million Americans versus 200 million Americans. So you still have the same issue, whether you're defending Seoul or Berlin, of are you going to be willing to sacrifice 20 million Americans? Maybe not 200, but at least 20.
But again, it's a counterfactual, right? Depending on the scenario and the day, there's no such, perfect damage limitation is sort of a very high bar, but meaningful damage limitation is not. And in a counterpopulation targeting strategy, you don't even have meaningful damage limitation. You have no damage limitation, right? You're essentially trading cities at that point. But the point is that the proponents of counterpopulation targeting are arguing we should shift to that so we don't have to deploy more forces. Now, Pranay and I say we don't even have to grow our stockpile, right? We have the numbers sort of already within the stockpile to meet the challenges. We just need to change the composition. But their argument is we don't even need to deploy more. We just move to counterpopulation targeting strategy. But if that increases the risk that your allies pursue their own nuclear weapons because they no longer believe that you're willing to defend them because you've now just exposed your homeland, or are you willing to trade a modest amount of, call it vertical proliferation or deployed numbers in the U.S. force to prevent Seoul and Poland and Germany from pursuing their own nuclear weapons? I would. I think that's a trade I'd be willing to
Yeah, but I'm not sure
accept.
that's the. I mean, has anyone done any extensive research on what our allies think about our commitment in terms of in the counter value right situation, you're trading a city, Boston for Berlin, but in a counter force situation, you might still be trading Boston for Berlin because enough missiles might get through that Boston does get destroyed. So, it's not like, as you said, there's no damage, so there will be millions of Americans dying for Berlin or Seoul. So if I'm in those countries, I'm still thinking that extended deterrence may be very weak because how many Americans is the United States president going to sacrifice for my country? That's still, in either scenario, it's still a question, right?
Now, you sound like Charles de Gaulle. So this was de Gaulle's calculation. De Gaulle and the French, and we're getting into sort of this Euro deterrent debate now about whether the Europeans can substitute for American extended deterrence. De Gaulle believed that no form of extended deterrence is credible. That's why France basically said, no matter what you do, right? We offered everything, including nuclear sharing to the French. And de Gaulle said, nah, I'm good. I'm going to get my own. And ultimately, that was founded on a belief that no extended deterrence commitment was fully credible. But France is the lone exception. Up till now, we have, call it up to around 34 formal allies, depending on who you count. France is the lone exception.
Well, the UK too, right?
So the UK got nuclear weapons before extended deterrence became a thing. It was sort of momentum after the.
But they kept it. They could have.
They kept it, but remember, after the sort of Skybolt and then Polaris, the UK is essentially so tightly integrated with the US that they do maintain independent sort of decision making, but programmatically, the UK and the US are essentially joined at the hip. France is truly independent in terms of production and capability, but they also sit outside NATO, which adds further complications. So I would argue France is the lone exception, and that every other state has made the calculation that they're willing to risk whatever sort of credibility gap there may be. I just think that, and I think our allies, and Pranay and I heard this from our allies directly, both sort of his counterparts at the political, sort of White House counterparts to the Élysée and the presidential offices, and me at the Departments of Defense, that, what is assuring to allies, we often ask, what does it take to deter? I think your question is actually a really important one, and one I want to do, pretty big research project on, which is what does it take to assure? And my anecdotal sense, based on my time in government, and I think Pranay would share this, is that while you can never perfectly assure allies, the damage limitation concept is the best assurant that we can provide, because they then believe in our willingness to fight on their behalf in ways that if we move to a counterpopulation targeting strategy, there's no doubt that they would not believe that we would be willing to fight on.
I mean, their decision to build and deploy nuclear weapons is not just, it doesn't just hinge on this one issue, right? There are many other concerns, including pulling out of the non-proliferation treaty, international implications of that in some countries like Japan, domestic opinion that's pretty anti-nuclear weapon for obvious reasons.
If you look at South Korea weaponizes their 70% support nuclear weapons, even though it's hard, even though it would hurt their economy, and even though have implications for the NPT. And I think Japan too, especially if South Korea went nuclear. I mean, this is why we spent so much time with South Korea when the Yoon government was making really credible noises about pursuing an independent capability, because it wouldn't just stop with South Korea. I'm not sure the NPT could survive an ally of the US that was in good standing, overtly or covertly cheating on the NPT. There's a possibility Japan would follow. There are possibilities Saudi Arabia and others in the Middle East would follow. There's a possibility Poland or Germany and others in Europe would follow. And that cascade effect is a world that I think is more dangerous for the US for a couple of reasons. One, you have a lot of states with small nuclear arsenals and itchy trigger fingers. I don't like that. You can't look at India and Pakistan.
Yeah. More proliferation is not good for the United States.
Yeah, I think, but you hear voices in the Trump administration who are pretty blasé about it. The old Waltzian line that more is better, right? Because
by the way, you have other states. You had MBS, I believe, last year or the year before, who said, right, if Iran got nuclear weapon, we will build nuclear weapons, right?
Yep. Well, we don't extend our deterrence to Saudi Arabia, so Saudi Arabia is not under our umbrella. So that's an important point. No one in the Middle East is under our umbrella. It stops at Turkey and NATO. But I think a world in which the reason why the U.S. has historically, there's a bipartisan consensus for the commitment to extended deterrence is because successive U.S. administrations have believed that proliferation by allies is not in American interests. It reduces our freedom of action. It increases the risk of nuclear employment by an ally. It also increases the risk of us getting dragged into somebody else's nuclear war, right? If a small South Korean nuclear arsenal gets an itchy trigger finger, and there's a nuclear employment in North Korea, we're still exposed to North Korean ICBMs. We're going to be dragged into that war. If you thought we were dragged into the Iran conflict, there's no way we could probably sit that one out. And so getting chain ganged into somebody else's nuclear war has been sort of the nightmare of American administration. So we've always tried to centralize nuclear decision-making in our alliance architecture. That's why France, I love the French, but the French are a pain in the ass, right? Their whole theory of the case was to start a nuclear war that the U.S. would have to finish. And they knew it.
And then they had all azimuth targeting, including targeting of us, right?
Right.
So, all right.
I do love the French.
Two more questions. One that I think is probably one of the most underrated stories in the last 8 or 9 months that most people missed, which is when the Biden administration at the time announced, and you guys talk about this in the article as well, that Pakistan is developing intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the United States. And you say that will make Pakistan an adversary of the United States because there's no other country, as you say, with ICBMs that can target the United States that is considered a friend. How confident are you that they're building ICBMs? You have folks like Jeffrey Lewis, a friend of our podcast, saying, well, maybe it's just a space launch vehicle. Maybe the goal is not really to target the United States. Do you believe that this is indeed the case?
So this created a bit of a kerfuffle because of the 7,000-word essay in Foreign Affairs that sort of touched on the whole range of nuclear issues. And we had this paragraph on Pakistan that was at one point deleted because of space constraints, but then after Operation Sindoor and the Pahalgam terrorist attacks and India's response with Operation Sindoor, we put it back in because we thought it was important. We didn't say anything that John Feiner, the Deputy National Security Advisor, didn't say publicly at Carnegie.
But everyone kind of missed that back in December.
So I bet John is sitting there smiling that the two brown guys are taking the fire for what he said. Look, I'm limited in what I can say, except that we don't say lightly when we say the U.S. intelligence community has concluded that Pakistan is developing a long-range missile that is capable of hitting the United States, or an ICBM capability capable of hitting the United States. And we speculate on what some of the reasons might be: to deter us from intervening in a conflict between India and Pakistan, to deter us from rendering safe the Pakistani nuclear arsenal. We don't know why. I don't know that there is sort of one reason, maybe, but this is a conclusion of the U.S. intelligence community, and it is not an imminent development. It is a program, and I think that's what, Feiner pointed to, but that no country has a land-based long-range missile system capable of hitting the United States and is a friend of the United States. And so if Pakistan continues with this, and this is the important point, if Pakistan continues with this program, we'll have no choice but to approach this program as if it's adversarial to the United States. And it's unclear to me why Pakistan would want to do this. I am not in the intelligence business, and I respect the intelligence community immensely. And so when they reach a conclusion, we take it seriously. And, we weren't trying to make news here. It isn't news. I would commend Feiner's speech here. And so at the unclassified level, Jeffrey's right. It could be consistent with a variety of things, but I think what Deputy National Security Advisor Feiner said was really important. If you parse it carefully, we're well aware of what it could look like, but that there is other evidence that suggests that this is related to an ICBM capability that may one day target the U.S.
Okay. Last question, and that has to do with, again, the core of your piece, which is the modernization of the nuclear arsenal. And a big part of that is the Sentinel program, replacing the 1970s era Minuteman ICBMs with the new Sentinel ICBMs. I believe the whole price tag of this modernization is $130 billion. I'm losing track. It keeps going up.
Yes.
But it's quite significant. It's not pocket change.
Yep.
Why not mobile launchers?
Oh, good
Could they
question.
be cheaper and more survivable?
No, it's not cheaper. We did an analysis of alternatives. Lived through parts of it. Some of my colleagues lived even deeper, and my heart goes out to them. A shout out to, and I think acting ASD Drew Walter right now, who's running the nukes office at the Pentagon. Lived this in and out through 2024. Until July, where we recertified the requirement for an ICBM. And we looked at we did analysis of alternatives. And one of them was a mobile ICBM, because it keeps coming up.
Our adversary seems to like them, so why not?
So I think it's important to note that our concept of the triad relies on each leg for different reasons. And we don't rely on the ICBM force for survivability because we have the submarines. So we don't need more survivability in the ICBMs. We rely on the ICBM force for promptness and for hard target, time-sensitive targets like Chinese ICBMs. And so mobile ICBMs actually take longer to get ready because you have to drive them out. You've got to erect the launcher, and they are very vulnerable in that point, but also your time-sensitive targets have sort of degraded then at that point. And so we rely on our ICBM force for promptness and for reliability. And the conclusion was that fixed silos in our theory of the whole symphony was still the most sensible option, and is cheaper than mobiles. Mobiles are more expensive. Even if you use if you used the base real estate because nobody wants ICBMs driving around American highways or their backyards. So you have the NIMBY problem. They're not all that survivable if they're just all located on the base to begin with, and they take longer to operationalize, and they're more expensive because the command and control elements that need to support mobile ICBMs are more expensive. And so there was really no clinching argument for mobiles. And you keep hearing this, but I don't see a single argument to move away from it. I think we need to hit Sentinel. It is, at this point, we're deep enough into it that pivoting would be more expensive than sticking with the delayed program. But it does mean we're going to have to get some end-of-life margin out of the Minuteman III, which was never designed to fly this long, but we can do it as we transition in these delays to Sentinel. But it's a good question because it keeps coming up, and I think it's important to think of and understand the role of the ICBM force in our entire force posture and why we have it, and the attributes of sort of a fixed silo ICBM like the Sentinel to replace Minuteman III, which is advantageous and cheaper than a mobile ICBM.
Well, that's it for us. Really interesting discussion. I hope you come back. There's a lot more to talk about.
Thanks,
on
Dmitri.
these
Always good to
issues.
see you.
And I don't think these issues, unfortunately, are going to go away.
Unfortunately, not. All hands on deck, and it does require the attention of our most senior leadership. And I think one thing I want to close on is you can't look at the last couple months between India, Pakistan, and then Israel, Iran, and not see nuclear touch everything. And the Ukraine conflict is still ongoing, so don't sleep on that. And China's sitting back, still building this superpower nuclear force. And so nuclear issues are here, and they're back with a vengeance. And we sort of forgot about it in the post-Cold War era and the global war on terror. And senior leaders wanted to pretend like nuclear weapons didn't exist. But, we sort of put our head in the sand at our own peril at this point.
Back to the future.
Back to the future, indeed.